I think creativity, at its root is really just seeing one thing as another thing, right? Like, can you make a translation of something elsewhere and reapply it? And for me, like the among creatives, I'm always a quant. Like I'm always the academic or the cerebral person that's maybe not as free flowing and creative. Among quants, I'm this like flowy creative guy, right? Like so I like kind of
Yeah.
like exist in the middle. And I think where that strength oftentimes, not just for myself, but as I've over the years gotten to work with how many people we come across that are pattern oriented. You find a lot of people that are both mathematically or engineering minded and musically minded, and so they have this like kind of pattern recognition that is very challenging for I think for a lot of people.
Very
Um,
true.
but they're also willing or able to make these leaps of if this is true within this discipline, the same must be true with perhaps a different set of parameters in a related discipline, or sometimes in a completely new discipline. And I think that those things in my career, like as I've gotten to go through and just kind of apply these little twists, are the things that oftentimes stand out, even if they seem very basic in the way that they're being applied. It's just a matter of like people not necessarily looking at one lesson as applicable across many fronts, right?
You bring up two really good points. Is one, this pattern recognition. I was just talking to another CEO today from a startup, and it was us and our founders and them. And by the way, all creative to some degree, in the way that we're describing. That was the other interesting thing I keep running into. I'll talk about that too. But what we were talking about in the conversation, I said, when I notice that I experience something or I see that other people experience it, even if it's just one, very quickly after that, I start to see a pattern of this occurrence for whatever the circumstance is.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of the times, what I use to solve problems is pattern recognition at its fundamental level. I go, how often is this happening? And when we start to talk about that, what do you get into? Data science, right?
Yeah.
I'm using a collection of incidents, anecdotes, patterns to determine what is the story behind or what stories can be told with this data or information so I can make decisions, whether that's creative or business or otherwise. And I think people who are creative have what my former CEO or friend called advanced pattern recognition, where they can draw conclusions a lot faster than most people can to empower their decisions. And that's not something that people would typify for creatives. Like, oh, they're very whimsical. You can't pin them down to do anything. And I see a lot of that as a pattern of behavior.
Sure.
But for the ones who have really mastered their pattern recognition, I think that they're also very good at quickly deriving a decision from there so that they can move forward. And you had this fantastic bit of advice that you received from a mentor you shared with me about making decisions.
I think, to this point of it's common amongst creatives, and it's not unique to creatives, right? Or at least not creatives in the fine arts sense. You can find a very, very similar skill set amongst engineers or other mindsets that are kind of like looking at these pieces, perhaps like operationally or whatever it may be. And I think that what's so important about that is that it gives you a language to communicate, right? If you are just handling something as it comes up and it comes up a dozen times, but you don't recognize it as pattern-based events, you just handle them as individual one-offs. There's no kind of efficiency gain. There's no growth either within the organization or for yourself. But it's also very hard to communicate with your team, with your executives around how we can continue to better the business, right? So this is something that I think is really important about pattern recognition, and it's something that it's easy to get lost in as you go through and start trying to say like, okay, I've seen a couple of connections. What else can I do? And if you have this kind of creative mind or this strategic mind in particular, like I tend to be a planner, I tend to be an organizer on these pieces. It's easy to then get lost in all of the detail of like, okay, like the first seven dominoes that have to fall are these, and then these are the paths that could come, second order consequence, third order consequence. And I had a terrific leader I followed at two different businesses, Ghazal Asif, who we would joke, had no distinction between thought and action. Like thought would come into her mind and she would just execute instantly. And luckily she had like terrific instincts. So those things were not necessarily getting her into trouble in those cases. But when she could see me get in these loops of, hey, like I see you going into the science lab and like really mulling out all of these like disparate strategies, what I need you to do is make a bad plan. And I think that's such a great piece of advice to people is the idea that like it doesn't have to be perfect. We can iterate regularly, but we're going to take action. And so if action is a bad plan of action, but it gets us moving, it's really critical, right?
It takes mastery of all those boring things that you do every day in the shed until you can go there and make it your own, and people recognize you as the talented, gifted salesperson or gifted leader. And really, at the end of the day, they have the opportunity to do the reps, to have all the failures, to perform and have a bad performance, so that they could show up in that role where you know them to be the mentor. You're like, oh, they have great intuition. I
Yeah.
guarantee while that person has intuition, she had intuition because she had enough failures and bad decisions that she could give you that specific advice and say, play a bad note. Let's just see what happens, but let's stick within the framework. I'm going to give you the freedom and the space to make a bad note, and just get out of your head because you're not taking action right now.